Bible stories often carry messages of transformation, redemption, and divine intervention that reach deep into our hearts. But among the countless stories within the Bible, few are as striking and transformative as the vision of Isaiah standing before the holy vision of God. In the sacred temple, Isaiah's eyes were opened to a sight so overwhelming it would forever alter his soul. There, upon the throne of God, surrounded by seraphim, glowing with radiance and burning with divine fire, he witnessed the eternal holiness of the Almighty. The seraphim, with their 6 wings, proclaimed with voices that shook the heavens and earth, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." In that moment, Isaiah's heart trembled. He stood before a presence so pure, so righteous, that his own sinfulness was made apparent in its shadow. His lips, unclean and stained, cried out in fear, knowing he was unworthy of such a divine encounter. But it was then, in the midst of his brokenness, that divine purification began. One of the seraphim, moved by grace, approached with a burning coal, drawn from the altar of God. It touched Isaiah's lips, searing with holy heat, yet cleansing him completely. "Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for," the seraphim declared. Isaiah was made new, reborn through divine atonement and the fire of God's mercy. This vision of Isaiah is not just a historical account. It is a powerful message about God's holiness and the purification that comes through his grace. It calls each of us to confront our own imperfections and seek the divine purification that can only be found in his presence. But how many of us, like Isaiah, have stood in the face of such holiness and found ourselves unworthy? And what happens when we allow ourselves to be purified by his divine fire? Isaiah's story is not just about a prophet. It's about every soul that seeks cleansing and renewal before a holy God. This story speaks to the heart of biblical storytelling, showing us that even in our darkest, most sinful moments, there is the possibility for redemption and transformation. The question is, are we ready to face our own purification, no matter how fierce the fire may be? The glorious scene of God's throne. There are moments in life that cannot be put into words. Moments when the weight of glory and holiness presses so deeply into your soul that every fiber of your being is awakened to something greater, something far beyond what you could have ever imagined. This is what Isaiah experienced as he stood in the presence of the Lord, gazing upon the throne of God. The vision that unfolded before Isaiah was unlike anything he had ever seen. In the temple, he saw the Lord seated high and exalted upon a throne, the divine radiance of his being spilling out in waves, filling every corner of the temple with glory. The very train of his robe seemed to stretch for miles, cascading like a mighty waterfall, flooding the temple with its magnificence. It was not just a sight to behold, but an encounter that shook the very core of Isaiah's heart. The temple was filled with the presence of God's holiness, and it was as if the world itself stood still in awe of the Lord's majesty. Isaiah was, in that moment, deeply aware of the vast gap between the holiness of God and the brokenness of humanity. He was standing before the Creator, and in that realization, the sacredness of this moment gripped him as it would any of us. Imagine for a moment standing in the presence of such overwhelming holiness, a holiness that transcends understanding, a glory that consumes everything in its path. What could we as humans possibly offer before such greatness? But in the midst of this overwhelming experience, the Lord did not call Isaiah to simply witness his glory and leave unchanged. Instead, he was inviting Isaiah into something far deeper, into a moment of purification, of transformation that would prepare him for the calling to come. As the vision unfolded, Isaiah saw not just the throne, but a scene filled with power and holiness beyond comprehension. God's throne was not simply a seat of power. It was a place where the purity and the might of God reigned supreme, where divine glory overflowed and everything around it was sanctified. What this moment teaches us is that God's holiness is not a passive characteristic. It is an active force that penetrates the very atmosphere we breathe, filling our lives with its radiance and demanding a response. Isaiah's vision invites us to reflect on our own understanding of God's holiness, not as a distant concept, but as something that invades and transforms our lives. When we encounter God, we are confronted with our own brokenness, but we are also offered the opportunity to be made whole, just as Isaiah was in that sacred moment. Isaiah's experience at the throne of God is a call for all of us to examine our own hearts in the light of His holiness. It's a reminder that no matter how far we may have fallen, no matter how unworthy we may feel in the presence of such purity, there is always an invitation to draw near, to stand before Him in reverence, and to receive His transforming power. The appearance of the seraphim. Hovering around the throne were beings of radiant power and mystery. The seraphim, heavenly creatures described with 6 wings, their appearance as blazing and fiery as the very holiness of God they served. These creatures were not just any ordinary angels. They were beings who embodied the glory and holiness of God in a way that transcended human understanding. They were radiant with brilliance, their voices powerful and majestic, echoing the divine proclamation, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of His glory." The seraphim's presence was not just an ornamental detail in the vision. They were central to the worship that took place around God's throne, declaring the holiness of the Lord in an eternal anthem that reverberated through heaven and earth. The repetition of the word holy was not a mere poetic device. It was a declaration of the utter perfection and majesty of God. The seraphim were not just praising, they were affirming the very nature of the Lord in ways that we as humans cannot fully comprehend. Their voices were not just heard, they were felt, shaking the foundations of the heavens and the earth, a divine resonance that carried with it the weight of all that is holy, all that is perfect, and all that is pure. Imagine for a moment being in a space where every sound, every vibration, every movement is filled with divine holiness. The sound of the seraphim's voices would have been nothing less than transformative, shaking Isaiah to his core. This scene teaches us something crucial about the nature of worship and the holiness of God. True worship is not just about the songs we sing or the words we speak. It is about the very essence of who we are in the presence of God. The seraphim's song, filled with holiness and awe, serves as a reminder that worship is a response to the overwhelming presence of the Almighty. In our own lives, we may not experience a literal vision of the seraphim around God's throne, but the holiness they proclaim is present with us every day. We are invited to respond to this holiness in our own worship, to stand in awe before the throne of God and declare His goodness, His glory, and His holiness. The seraphim's song calls us to do more than just acknowledge God. It calls us to worship Him in spirit and truth, to allow His presence to penetrate every corner of our lives, just as the glory of God filled the temple. The lesson here is profound. True worship is not something we can manufacture. It is a response to God's holiness and glory. It is about recognizing the magnitude of His presence in our lives and allowing that awareness to shape everything we do. Just as the seraphim could not contain their praise in the presence of God, we too are called to live lives that reflect the awe and reverence of His holiness. As we move from this vision, we are faced with an important question. How do we respond to the holiness of God in our own lives? Are we, like the seraphim, willing to proclaim His glory with every fiber of our being, Or do we allow the weight of His holiness to pass by unnoticed? The call is clear: to worship Him with our hearts, our lives, and everything we are. In this narrative, we've journeyed through Isaiah's encounter with the throne of God and the seraphim, both of which reflect the holiness of God. The seraphim's proclamation invites us into a deeper understanding of worship, one that is not about ritual, but about responding to God's presence in our lives. How we respond to this presence is at the heart of our relationship with God, and this is the lesson that we must carry forward into our own worship and daily lives. As Isaiah's experience shows, there is always an invitation to step into the presence of God, to be transformed by His holiness, and to declare His glory in all that we do. Isaiah's response: fear, humility, and confession. In the overwhelming presence of God's holiness, Isaiah, a prophet chosen by God, found himself utterly undone. Standing in the temple before the throne of God, surrounded by the radiant light and the angelic chorus of the seraphim, he was confronted not only with the majesty of the divine, but also with the stark reality of his own sinfulness. This was no ordinary vision. It was a divine confrontation, a moment of profound self-awareness. Isaiah's immediate reaction was one of deep humility and fear, for he realized he was unworthy to be in the presence of such holiness. He cried out, "Woe to me! I am ruined! For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." Isaiah's response is one that echoes through the ages, reflecting a timeless truth about the human condition. When we encounter God's holiness, we are forced to confront the gap between His perfection and our imperfection. Isaiah's words, "I am undone," are not just a statement of regret, but a recognition of the divine standard that highlights the fallen nature of humanity. He did not stand proud in his calling. He was not filled with a sense of superiority because of his prophetic role. Instead, he recognized that in the light of God's glory, even his greatest righteousness was as filthy rags. He was, like all of us, in desperate need of cleansing. This moment of self-awareness serves as a mirror for our own lives. Just as Isaiah could not stand before God's holiness without being overwhelmed by his own unworthiness, we too are confronted with the truth of our own brokenness when we come into the presence of the divine. It is easy to get lost in the busyness of life, to forget the need for personal reflection, but moments like this remind us of the transforming power of humility. When we truly understand our need for God, it is then that we can begin the process of restoration and renewal. Isaiah's cry of despair, though filled with fear, was the catalyst for the next step in his divine encounter. His humility made way for grace, and in that space, he was ready for the divine cleansing that was about to come. His confession opened the door for the seraphim to minister to him in a way that would forever change the course of his life. This is the beauty of the divine encounter. In our deepest moments of brokenness, we can experience the fullness of God's grace. This is the lesson for us today. True humility leads to transformation. Without the confession of our brokenness, we cannot experience the depth of the divine cleansing and renewal that God offers. Isaiah's story is a reminder that we must never forget the importance of humility in the face of God's holiness. The path to spiritual renewal begins with recognizing our own unworthiness, but it does not end there. It is through God's grace, like the coal that touched Isaiah's lips, that we are made clean and prepared for the mission God has for us. The seraphim's cleansing, divine purification, and atonement. As Isaiah cried out in his despair, his confession became the turning point in his encounter with God. It was in this moment of humility that the seraphim acted, moving with divine purpose to bring about Isaiah's purification. One of the seraphim, with a burning coal taken from the altar of God, flew to Isaiah. The coal, which glowed with divine purity, was placed upon his lips. The heat was intense, searing through his very being, but it was not destructive. It was cleansing. "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for," the seraphim proclaimed. This act of divine purification is profound. The coal is not just a symbolic gesture, it is a tangible moment of atonement, a vivid picture of the cleansing that God offers to all who seek Him. The coal symbolizes the sacrifice that would one day be made on the cross, where the ultimate act of atonement would occur. Through the fire of the coal, Isaiah's sin was not just covered, it was removed. This was not a mere symbolic act. It was a powerful display of God's grace, the means by which Isaiah was made clean and ready for the work God was about to call him to. This moment of purification teaches us several crucial lessons about our own journey of faith. First, it shows us that atonement is not something we can achieve on our own. Just as Isaiah could not cleanse himself, we too cannot purify ourselves. It is only through God's intervention, through the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, that we are made clean. Second, it reminds us that the process of purification can be painful. The fire of the coal was intense, yet it was necessary for Isaiah to be prepared for the mission ahead. Similarly, in our own lives, spiritual purification may involve discomfort as we confront our own sin and the need for transformation. But it is through this purification that we are made ready to be instruments of God's will in the world. Finally, the seraphim's action illustrates a powerful truth. Atonement is not just about forgiveness, it is about restoration. Isaiah's sin was atoned for, but he was not just forgiven, he was transformed. He was renewed and empowered for the mission that lay ahead. This is the heart of the gospel. God's grace is not just about covering our sin, it is about changing us, making us new creations, ready to fulfill the purposes He has for us. In our own lives, we are constantly in need of purification and atonement. We may not experience a literal coal upon our lips, but we are invited to come before God with humility, confessing our sin and accepting the cleansing that only He can provide. Just as Isaiah was renewed in that moment, we too can be made new, equipped and empowered to live out our calling as God's people in the world. This powerful act of atonement is available to all who seek it, and it is a reminder that no matter how far we may have fallen, there is always hope for restoration in the presence of God. As we reflect on Isaiah's experience, we are reminded that true spiritual transformation begins with an honest recognition of our need for cleansing. Just as the coal purified Isaiah's lips, we too must allow God's grace to purify our hearts and minds, preparing us for the work He has called us to do. This is not a one-time event, but a continuous journey of renewal and transformation as we daily submit ourselves to the fire of God's holiness and grace. In this section, we witness Isaiah's journey from brokenness to renewal. His confession of sin led to a moment of purification that forever changed him. And through it, we see the beauty of God's grace and the transformative power of atonement. It is a reminder for us all that in the presence of God's holiness, we are called to recognize our need for cleansing, and through His grace, we are made ready to fulfill our divine calling. Isaiah's calling. A divine mission revealed. After Isaiah's purification and atonement, he was not only cleansed, but prepared for the calling that lay ahead. In that sacred space, where the weight of God's holiness had transformed him, the divine mission was revealed. The next phase of Isaiah's journey was not just a return to normal life, but a profound divine calling that would change the course of history. In the silence that followed the angel's proclamation of forgiveness, Isaiah heard the voice of the Lord. "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" The voice was powerful, reverberating through the temple and shaking Isaiah to his very core. It was not just a rhetorical question, but a call to action. The moment Isaiah had been waiting for had arrived. His life had been transformed, and now the Lord was asking him to step into his divine plan for the world. Isaiah's response was simple yet profound. "Here am I. Send me." With these words, Isaiah accepted his calling. This wasn't just a response to an opportunity. It was the moment when he embraced his role in God's grand design. Having been purified, forgiven, and renewed, he was now ready to take on the task that God had set before him. The lesson here is significant. Isaiah's willingness to respond to God's call is a powerful example of what it means to be fully surrendered to divine will. It shows that spiritual purification is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. God cleanses us, not just for our sake, but for the sake of his kingdom. Purification prepares us for service. It equips us to step into the roles God has destined for us. But what does it mean to truly answer God's call? In our own lives, we often ask ourselves what our purpose is, and we wonder if we are truly hearing from God. The reality is that his calling is not always loud and clear, and it may not always align with our plans or desires. However, the story of Isaiah reminds us that when we are open, humble, and purified, we are better able to hear and recognize God's voice, and we are equipped to step forward with confidence. The question for us, as it was for Isaiah, is whether we will respond. Are we ready to say, "Here am I, send me"? It's easy to assume that God's call must come with grand, spectacular signs, but in reality it is often quiet and personal. God's voice speaks to us in our hearts, urging us to serve in ways that are sometimes small, but always significant. It may be a call to serve in our communities, to support others, or to make a difference in the lives of those around us. These calls, though seemingly small, are part of God's divine mission for our lives. Isaiah's willingness to go was not based on a guarantee of success or even safety. The mission that he was called to was not an easy one. In fact, God's instructions to Isaiah were daunting. He was called to speak to a people who would not listen, to preach a message that would be rejected. But Isaiah's readiness to serve was not dependent on his understanding of the task. His obedience came from his trust in God's purpose, knowing that God's plan was always greater than his own understanding. This brings us to a crucial point in our own faith journeys. When we are called to serve or to take a step of faith, it's easy to let fear and doubt creep in. We often question whether we are qualified, whether we will succeed, or whether the task is too great. But Isaiah's story teaches us that obedience to God's call is not about having all the answers or understanding the entire picture. It is about trust and willingness. When we say, "Here am I, send me," we are acknowledging that God's will is the guiding force, not our own limitations. The divine mission Isaiah was called to was not for personal glory or comfort. It was about advancing God's kingdom. This is where the true essence of obedience lies, not in doing what is easy or comfortable, but in aligning our lives with the purposes of God. When Isaiah said, "Send me," he was not just accepting a role, he was stepping into God's plan, a plan that would require courage, sacrifice, and faith. As believers today, we are also called to be a part of God's mission. The calling may not always be as dramatic as Isaiah's, but it is just as important. God has a purpose for each of us, a task that is uniquely ours to fulfill. The key is to be open to his voice, to be purified and prepared through his grace, and then to step forward in obedience, no matter how daunting the task may seem. Isaiah's willingness to follow God's call, despite the uncertainty, is a challenge and an inspiration to us all. As we reflect on this, we might ask ourselves, what is God calling me to do? How can I respond as Isaiah did with a willing heart, ready to serve in whatever way he asks? It may not be easy, and it may not always make sense in the moment, but when we respond with the same faith and trust that Isaiah demonstrated, we join a long line of believers who have stepped forward in obedience, fulfilling God's purposes in the world. Isaiah's journey shows us that spiritual renewal is not just about personal transformation. It is about being equipped and sent out to be a vessel of God's message to the world. God's calling does not always come with a grand announcement or a perfect plan. Often it is a quiet whisper in our hearts, urging us to step out in faith. It is our willingness to answer that determines the impact we can have in the world. Just as Isaiah became a voice for God, so too can we become instruments of his message, bringing light and hope to a world in need. As we reflect on the powerful story of Isaiah's divine calling, it becomes clear that his journey is not just one of ancient history, but a story that resonates deeply within each of us. Isaiah stood before the holiness of God, and through his encounter, we are invited to examine our own lives in the light of divine grace and purification. Just as Isaiah was cleansed and renewed, we too are offered that same opportunity for transformation, no matter where we stand in our own spiritual journeys. His experience serves as a profound reminder that, through humility and obedience, we are able to step into the calling God has designed for us, even when it seems impossible or beyond our understanding. In the world we live in today, it can often feel like we are constantly searching for meaning, looking for a glimpse of hope in the midst of trials, or trying to find our place in a world that can sometimes feel overwhelming. But like Isaiah, we too are called to find our purpose in the presence of God. His story invites us to remember that no matter how dark our circumstances may seem, there is always hope. The holiness of God shines through even the darkest of moments. And it is through our obedience and willingness to surrender to His will that we are purified and renewed. If this message has spoken to your heart, if you felt a stirring deep within you, or if you found a new sense of direction or peace, I want to ask for your support. Or God's word has the power to transform, to heal, and to guide us, and sharing this truth with the world is something I am deeply passionate about. Every message, every piece of content, and every story shared is a step toward helping others find the light they are searching for. So, if you feel that this video has brought value to your soul, if it has been a light in the midst of dark days, I invite you to support me in continuing to create and share these videos. Whether it's a like, a comment, or even subscribing, your support helps keep this channel alive, growing, and reaching more people with the truth of God's love. Your encouragement means the world to me. It allows me to keep producing content that speaks directly to the hearts of those who are searching for a deeper connection with their faith. If you're moved to do so, I've included a link to donate in the video description. No contribution is too small, and every bit helps in continuing to spread these biblical truths to those who need them most. Just as Isaiah was called to share the word of God despite the challenges, I too am stepping forward in faith to continue this work, trusting that through your support, we can touch more lives and spread the message of hope and divine transformation. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this journey. Your belief in the power of God's word is what makes all of this possible, and I am deeply grateful for your continued support. Together, we can continue to share these stories and bring light to those who need it the most. Let's continue to walk this path of faith, knowing that God has a purpose for each of us, just as He had a divine calling for Isaiah. If this video has made a difference in your life, I encourage you to share it with someone who may need to hear it. You never know how much it could impact someone else's life. May the peace and light of God surround you, and may you feel His presence guiding you through every step of your journey. God bless you, and thank you again for being here. Let's continue to explore the deep Bible stories, uncover the mysteries of the Bible, and be renewed in the truths that are woven through every page. Together, we are part of something much larger, something divine, and something filled with endless hope.